Hello, this is John T. Rhapsodes Esquire, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories, bringing you a Western story today from 1907 called The Reformation of Calliope by O. Henry. William Sidney Porter, writing under the name O. Henry, walked the earth from 1862 to 1910. Hear the words of old. The Reformation of Calliope, from 1907, by O. Henry. Calliope Catesby was in his humors again. Ennui, or feelings of weariness or dissatisfaction, was upon him. This goodly promontory, the earth, particularly that portion of it known as quicksand, was to him no more than a pestilent congregation of vapors. Overtaken by the megrims, or low spirits, the philosopher may seek relief in soliloquy. My lady finds solace in tears. The flaccid Easterner scold at the millinery bills of his womenfolk. Such recourse was insufficient to the denizens of quicksand. Calliope especially was wont to express his ennui according to his lights. Overnight, Calliope had hung out signals of approaching low spirits. He had kicked his own dog on the porch of the Occidental Hotel and refused to apologize. He had become capricious and fault-finding in conversation. While strolling about, he reached often for twigs of mesquite and chewed the leaves fiercely. That was always an ominous act. Another symptom alarming to those who were familiar with the different stages of his doldrums was his increasing politeness and a tendency to use formal phrases. A husky softness succeeded the usual penetrating drawl in his tones. A dangerous courtesy marked his manners. Later, his smile became crooked, the left side of his mouth slanting upward, and quicksand got ready to stand from under. At this stage, Calliope generally began to drink. Finally, about midnight, he was seen going homeward, saluting those whom he met with exaggerated but inoffensive courtesy. Not yet was Calliope's melancholy at the danger point. He would seat himself at the window of the room he occupied over Sylvester's tonsorial parlors, and there chant lugubrious and tuneless ballads until morning, accompanying the noises by appropriate maltreatment of a jangling guitar. More magnanimous than Nero, he would thus give musical warning of the forthcoming municipal upheaval that quicksand was scheduled to endure. A quiet, amiable man was Calliope Catesby at other times, quiet to indolence, and amiable to worthlessness. At best, he was a loafer and a nuisance. At worst, he was the terror of quicksand. His ostensible occupation was something subordinate in the real estate line. He drove the beguiled Easterner and buckboards out to look over lots and ranch property. Originally, he came from one of the Gulf states. His lank 6 feet, slurring rhythm of speech, and sectional idioms giving evidence of his birthplace. And yet, after taking on Western adjustments, this languid pine-box whittler, cracker-barrel hugger, shady corner lounger of the cotton fields and sumac hills of the South, became famed as a bad man among men who had made a lifelong study of the art of truculence. At 9 the next morning, Calliope was fit. Inspired by his own barbarous melodies and the contents of his jug, he was ready primed to gather fresh laurels from the diffident brow of quicksand. Encircled and crisscrossed with cartridge belts, abundantly garnished with revolvers, and copiously drunk, he poured forth into quicksand's main street. Too chivalrous to surprise and capture a town by silent sortie, he paused at the nearest corner and emitted his slogan, that fearful brassy yell so reminiscent of the steam piano or calliope that had gained for him the classic appellation that had superseded his own baptismal name. Following close upon his vociferation came 3 shots from his .45 by way of limbering up the guns and testing his aim. A yellow dog, the personal property of Colonel Swayze, the proprietor of the Occidental, fell feet upward in the dust with one farewell yelp. A Mexican who was crossing the street from the Blue Front grocery, carrying in his hand a bottle of kerosene, was stimulated to a sudden and admirable burst of speed, still grasping the neck of the shattered bottle. The new gilt weathercock on Judge Riley's lemon and ultramarine 2-story residence shivered, flapped, and hung by a splinter, the sport of the wanton breezes. The artillery was in trim. Calliope's hand was steady. The high, calm ecstasy of habitual battle was upon him, though slightly embittered by the sadness of Alexander and that his conquests were limited to the small world of quicksand. Down the street went Calliope, shooting right and left. Glass fell like hail. Dogs vamoosed. Chickens flew squawking. Feminine voices shrieked concernedly to youngsters at large. The din was perforated at intervals by the staccato of terror's guns, and was drowned periodically by the brazen screech that quicksand knew so well. The occasions of Calliope's low spirits were legal holidays in quicksand. All along the main street in advance of his coming, clerks were putting up shutters and closing doors. Business would languish for a space. The right-of-way was Calliope's, and as he advanced, observing the dearth of opposition and the few opportunities for distraction, his ennui perceptibly increased. But some 4 squares farther down, lively preparations were being made to minister to Mr. Catesby's love for interchange of compliments and repartee. On the previous night, numerous messengers had hastened to advise Buck Patterson, the city marshal, of Calliope's impending eruption. The patience of that official, often strained in extending leniency toward the disturber's misdeeds, had been overtaxed. In quicksand, some indulgence was accorded the natural ebullition of human nature, providing that the lives of the more useful citizens were not recklessly squandered, or too much property needlessly laid waste. The community's sentiment was against a too strict enforcement of the law. But Calliope had raised the limit. His outbursts had been too frequent and too violent to come within the classification of a normal and sanitary relaxation of spirit. Buck Patterson had been expecting and awaiting in his little 10x12 frame office that preliminary yell announcing that Calliope was feeling blue. When the signal came, the city marshal rose to his feet and buckled on his guns. 2 deputy sheriffs and 3 citizens who had proven the edible qualities of fire also stood up, ready to bandy with Calliope's leaden jocularities. "Gather that fella in," said Buck Patterson. setting forth the lines of the campaign. Don't have no talk, but shoot as soon as you can get a show. Keep behind cover and bring him down. He's a no-good'n. It's up to Calliope to turn up his toes this time, I reckon. Go to 'em all spraddled out, boys, and don't get too reckless, for what Calliope shoots at, he hits. Buck Patterson, tall, muscular, and solemn-faced, with his bright city marshal badge shining on the breast of his blue flannel shirt, gave his posse directions for the onslaught upon Calliope. The plan was to accomplish the downfall of the quicksand terror without loss to the attacking party, if possible. The splenetic Calliope, unconscious of retributive plots, was steaming down the channel, cannonading on either side, when he suddenly became aware of breakers ahead. The city marshal and one of the deputies rose up behind some dry goods boxes half a square to the front and opened fire. At the same time, the rest of the posse, divided, shelled them from two side streets up which they were cautiously maneuvering from a well-executed detour. The first volley broke the lock of one of Calliope's guns, cut a neat underbit in his right ear, and exploded a cartridge in his crossbelt, scorching his ribs as it burst. Feeling braced up by this unexpected tonic to his spiritual depression, Calliope executed a fortissimo note from his upper register and returned the fire like an echo. The upholders of the law dodged at his flash, but a trifle too late to save one of the deputies a bullet just above the elbow, and the marshal a bleeding cheek from a splinter that a ball tore from the box he had ducked behind. And now Calliope met the enemy's tactics in kind. Choosing with a rapid eye the street from which the weakest and least accurate fire had come, he invaded it at a double quick, abandoning the unprotected middle of the street. With rare cunning, the opposing force in that direction, one of the deputies and two of the valorous volunteers, waited, concealed by beer barrels, until Calliope had passed their retreat and then peppered him from the rear. In another moment they were reinforced by the marshal and his other men, and then Calliope felt that in order to successfully prolong the delights of the controversy, he must find some means of reducing the great odds against him. His eye fell upon a structure that seemed to hold out this promise, providing he could reach it. Not far away was the little railroad station, its building a strong-box house, 10 by 20 feet, resting upon a platform 4 feet above the ground. Windows were in each of its walls. Something like a fort it might become to a man thus sorely pressed by superior numbers. Calliope made a bold and rapid spurt for it, the marshal's crowd smoking him as he ran. He reached the haven in safety, the station agent leaving the building by a window, like a flying squirrel, as the garrison entered the door. Patterson and his supporters halted under protection of a pile of lumber and held consultations. In the station was an unterrified desperado who was an excellent shot and carried an abundance of ammunition. For 30 yards on either side of the besieged was a stretch of bare open ground. It was a sure thing that the man who attempted to enter that unprotected area would be stopped by one of Calliope's bullets. The city marshal was resolved. He had decided that Calliope Catesby should no more wake the echoes of quicksand with his strident whoop. He had so announced. Officially and personally, he felt imperatively bound to put the soft pedal on that instrument of discord. it played bad tunes. Standing near was a hand truck used in the manipulation of small freight. It stood by a shed full of sacked wool, a consignment from one of the sheep ranches. On this truck the marshal and his men piled 3 heavy sacks of wool. Stooping low, Buck Patterson started for Calliope's fort, slowly pushing this loaded truck before him for protection. The posse, scattering broadly, stood ready to nip the besieged in case he should show himself in an effort to repel the juggernaut of justice that was creeping upon him. Only once did Calliope make demonstration. He fired from a window, and some tufts of wool spurted from the marshal's trustworthy bulwark. The return shots from the posse pattered against the window frame of the fort. No loss resulted on either side. The marshal was too deeply engrossed in steering his protected battleship to be aware of the approach of the morning train until he was within a few feet of the platform. The train was coming up on the other side of it. It stopped only 1 minute at Quicksand. What an opportunity it would offer to Calliope. He had only to step out the other door, mount the train, and away. Abandoning his breastwork, Buck, with his gun ready, dashed up the steps and into the room, driving upon the closed door with one heave of his weighty shoulder. The members of the posse heard one shot fired inside, and then there was silence. At length the wounded man opened his eyes. After a blank space he again could see and hear and feel and think. Turning his eyes about, he found himself lying on a wooden bench. A tall man with a perplexed countenance, wearing a big badge with City Marshal engraved upon it, stood over him. A little old woman in black, with a wrinkled face and sparkling black eyes, was holding a wet handkerchief against one of his temples. He was trying to get these facts fixed in his mind and connected with past events when the old woman began to talk. "There now, great big strong man. That bullet never touched you. Just skeeted along the side of your head and sort of paralyzed you for a spell. I've heard of such things afore. Concussion is what they names it. Abel Watkins used to kill squirrels that away. Barking 'em, Abe called it. You just been barked, sir, and you'll be all right in a little bit. Feel lots better already, don't you? You just lay still a while longer and let me bathe your head. You don't know me, I reckon, and 'tain't surprising that you shouldn't. I come in on that train from Alabama to see my son. Big son, ain't he? Lands, you wouldn't hardly think he'd ever been a baby, would you? This is my son, sir." Half turning, the old woman looked up at the standing man, her worn face lighting with a proud and wonderful smile. She reached out one veined and calloused hand and took one of her sons. Then, smiling cheerfully down at the prostrate man, she continued to dip the handkerchief in the waiting room tin wash basin and gently apply it to his temple. She had the benevolent garrulity of old age. "I ain't seen my son in 8 years, she continued. "One of my nephews, Elkanah Price, he's a conductor on one of them railroads, and he got me a pass to come out here. I can stay a whole week on it, and then it'll take me back again. Just think now, that little boy of mine has got to be an officer, a city marshal of a whole town. That's something like a constable, ain't it? I never knowed he was an officer. He didn't say nothing about it in his letters. I reckon he thought his old mama'd be scared about the danger he was in. But laws, I never was much of a hand to get scared. 'Tain't no use. I heard them guns a-shootin' while I was gettin' off them cars, and I see smoke a-comin' out of the depot, but I just walked right along. Then I see my son's face lookin' out through the window. I knowed him at onct. He met me at the door and squeezes me most to death. And there you was, sir, a-lyin' there just like you was dead. And I 'lowed we'd see what might be done to help sot you up." "I think I'll sit up now," said the concussion patient. "I'm feeling pretty fair by this time." He sat, somewhat weakly yet, leaning against the wall. He was a rugged man, big-boned and straight. His eyes, steady and keen, seemed to linger upon the face of the man standing so still above him. His look wandered often from the face he studied to the marshal's badge upon the other's breast. "Yes, yes, you'll be all right," said the old woman, patting his arm. "If you don't get to cutting up again and having folks shooting at you. Son told me about you, sir, while you was laying senseless on the floor. Don't you take it as meddlesome for an old woman with a son as big as you to talk about it. And you mustn't hold no grudge against my son for having to shoot at you. An officer has got to take up for the law. It's his duty. And them that acts bad and lives wrong has to suffer. Don't blame my son any, sir. 'Tain't his fault. He's always been a good boy, good when he was growing up, and kind and obedient and well-behaved. Won't you let me advise you, sir, not to do so no more? Be a good man, and leave liquor alone, and live peaceably and goodly. Keep away from bad company, and work honest and sleep sweet." The black-mitted hand of the old pleader gently touched the breast of the man she addressed. Very earnest and candid her old worn face looked. In her rusty black dress and antique bonnet she sat, near the close of a long life, and epitomized the experience of the world. Still the man to whom she spoke gazed above her head, contemplating the silent son of the old mother. "What does the marshal say?" he asked. "Does he believe the advice is good? Suppose the marshal speaks up and says if the talk's all right." The tall man moved uneasily. He fingered the badge on his breast for a moment, and then he put an arm around the old woman and drew her close to him. She smiled the unchanging mother smile of 80 years, and patted his big brown hand with her crooked, mittened fingers while her son spake. "I says this," he said, looking squarely into the eyes of the other man, "that if I was in your place I'd follow it. If I was a drunken, desperate character, without shame or hope, I'd follow it. If I was in your place and you was in mine, I'd say, 'Marshal, I'm willing to swear if you'll give me the chance, I'll quit the racket. I'll drop the tanglefoot and the gunplay and won't play hoss no more. I'll be a good citizen and go to work and quit my foolishness, so help me God.' That's what I'd say to you if you was marshal and I was in your place." "Hear my son talking," said the old woman softly. "Hear him, sir. You promised to be good and he won't do you no harm. 41 years ago his heart first beat agin mine, and it's beat true ever since." The other man rose to his feet, trying his limbs and stretching his muscles. "Then," said he, "if you was in my place and said that, and I was marshal, I'd say, 'Go free and do your best to keep your promise.'" "Lawsy!" exclaimed the old woman in a sudden flutter. "If I didn't clear forget that trunk of mine. I see a man setting it on the platform just as I seen son's face in the window, and it went plumb out of my head. There's 8 jars of homemade quince jam in that trunk that I made myself. I wouldn't have nothing happen to them jars for a red apple." Away to the door she trotted, spry and anxious, and then Calliope Catesby spoke out to Buck Patterson. "I just couldn't help it, Buck. I seen her through the window a-comin' in. She never had heard a word about my tough ways. I didn't have the nerve to let her know I was a worthless cuss being hunted down by the community. There you was, lying where my shot laid you, like you was dead. The idea struck me sudden, and I just took your badge off and fastened it onto myself, and I fastened my reputation onto you. I told her I was the marshal, and you was a holy terror. You can take your badge back now, Buck." With shaking fingers, Calliope began to unfasten the disc of metal from his shirt. "Easy there," said Buck Patterson. "You keep that badge right where it is, Calliope Catesby. Don't you dare to take it off till the day your mother leaves this town. You'll be the city marshal of Quicksand as long as she's here to know it. After I stir around town a bit and put 'em on, I'll guarantee that nobody won't give the thing away to her. And say, you leather-headed, rip-roaring, low-down son of a locoed cyclone, you follow that advice she give me. I'm going to take some of it myself, too." "Buck," said Calliope feelingly, "if I don't hope I may—" "Shut up," said Buck. "She's a-comin' back." And that concludes O. Henry's 1907 story called The Reformation of Calliope. This is John T. Rhapsodies, Esquire, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories. Thank you for listening. You can find more stories like this in the channel's playlists. Find them by staying tuned for the last 20 seconds of this video and clicking on the end screen icons. You can also go to the channel homepage and click on the playlist tab. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, please help me earn the warm embrace of Mr. and Mrs. YouTubes who look with loving favor upon those channels whose listeners faithfully subscribe, like, comment, click the notification bell, and share the videos with their friends so that they too can hear the words of old.